please leave our home immediately and take all of your belongings with you? The clutter is overwhelming, and there is no place for your things here anymore." As I stood there, trying to process what was happening, Susan waved me off dismissively, clearly irritated by my presence. Before I could even react, Stephen stepped in, his tone sharp and impatient. "Make sure you don't leave any mess behind," he added, as if I was an inconvenience rather than his wife of 20 years. A wave of disbelief washed over me. It was astonishing how, despite being caught in their deception, they remained unapologetically bold, demanding that I leave so they could live together. Their audacity knew no bounds. However, I couldn't help but wonder if they had even considered the compromising evidence I had against them. For now, I decided to let them bask in their illusion of victory. A sly grin formed on my lips as I turned away from them both, retreating into what was still, for the moment, my sanctuary. My name is Abigail Ruth, and for the past 20 years, I have been married to Stephen. I am 45 years old, a home-based designer, and Stephen, 4 years my senior, works as a systems engineer. We have a son, Gary, who is now 21 and deeply focused on his college studies. To outsiders, our family may have seemed picture-perfect, but the truth was far from ideal. Over time, Stephen's behavior had changed. He started sneaking out, coming home late, and displaying a level of secrecy that raised my suspicions. It was these signs that led me to the painful conclusion that my marriage was coming to an end. Looking back, I could see the cracks that had formed long before now. Stephen had changed significantly over the years, particularly during a difficult financial period when our son was entering middle school. His income had taken a hit due to the struggling economy, and while I tried to address our financial struggles with him, he responded with anger rather than solutions. That moment marked the beginning of a shift in our relationship, leaving me to handle the challenges alone while Stephen grew increasingly distant. Before we got married, I had worked in a design firm, but I left my job to focus on building our home life. Years later, a former colleague, who had since started her own business, reached out to me for assistance. Despite the long hiatus from my career, I was excited about the opportunity and eagerly accepted her offer to work from home. When I shared the news with Stephen, his reaction was lukewarm. He barely acknowledged it with a simple, "okay," showing no real interest in what it meant for me. Regardless of his indifference, I threw myself into the work, finding solace in something I was passionate about. One day, Gary unexpectedly came home early, disrupting my usual work routine. "I got out early because of midterms," he explained. I had completely forgotten, despite it being marked on our calendar. As I rushed to prepare him something to eat, he noticed my workstation set up in the living room. I quickly apologized for the mess, promising to tidy up, but he waved it off, more excited to share something else with me. He had been working on developing a video game, driven by his ambition to follow in his father's footsteps as an engineer. Though it wasn't as polished as mainstream games, his effort was evident, and I was impressed. When he told me he wanted to attend a vocational school to further develop his skills, I could see how passionate he was. He hoped for his father's support, but when Stephen saw the game later that evening, his reaction was anything but encouraging. He dismissed Gary's hard work as childish and insignificant. I was furious at his harsh attitude. To him, it was just a silly game, but to Gary, it was his dream. As I stood up for our son, Stephen's annoyance escalated, and he accused me of spoiling him. I knew arguing with him was pointless, so I chose silence. Instead, I quietly resolved to support Gary in my own way. The next day, with Stephen at work, I offered Gary a solution. "I'll get you a high-quality computer for game development. If your dad asks, I'll say it's for my work." As expected, when Stephen noticed the new setup, he gave me a skeptical look, but I simply stated that it was necessary for my job. Though he remained unconvinced, I didn't care. I had done what was right for my son. As the months passed, Gary left for college, determined to pursue his passion. I knew he hoped for his father's approval, but I also saw that he had the maturity to move forward regardless. Then, one day, he came home looking distressed, alarmed. I asked him what was wrong. After hesitating, he finally admitted what had been troubling him. He had seen Stephen with another woman. Gary recounted the unexpected moment in detail. He had planned to attend a lecture, but when it was cancelled, he spent the day downtown with friends. That's when he saw his father, walking hand in hand with a much younger woman. Though he tried to act unaffected in front of his friends, the sight unsettled him so much that he came home early. Hearing this, I wasn't entirely surprised. I had long suspected Stephen's infidelity, his secretive phone calls, his erratic schedule. It had all pointed to this moment. To confirm my suspicions, I had hired a private investigator, and what they uncovered left no doubt. Stephen was having an affair. When I shared my findings with Gary, he was visibly shocked but fully supportive of my decision to handle things calmly and possibly pursue a divorce. I planned to confront Stephen, but he didn't come home that night. It was as if he knew that his secret had been exposed. When he finally returned on Sunday, he was not alone. He had the audacity to bring Susan with him, a younger woman who, with an air of arrogance, introduced herself as his girlfriend. Stephen, completely shameless, announced that he was leaving me for Susan. As if that wasn't insulting enough, he made a crude remark about my age, as though I was disposable. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. You're not the first man to trade in his wife for a younger model, Stephen. Congratulations on being a cliché, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Susan, emboldened by Stephen's presence, urged me to move out immediately. Without hesitation, she produced divorce papers, which I signed without a second thought. Their entitlement was almost amusing, demanding that I leave my own home so they could be together without a hint of remorse. What they didn't realize was that I had more power than they assumed. I knew their so-called victory was premature. I had evidence of Stephen's infidelity, which could greatly affect the divorce settlement, but for now, I let them have their moment, smirking to myself as I walked away. Before starting the process of packing my belongings, I arranged for a junk removal service to clear out what I no longer needed. As I sorted through my things, I heard the sound of raised voices from the living room. Gary had returned home and was confronting his father. His anger was evident as he demanded answers, insisting that Stephen at least show me the respect of an apology. But Stephen, as expected, remained dismissive. The conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument, and then, just as suddenly, the house fell into silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, waiting to see what would happen next. I quietly peeked into the living room, expecting to see Stephen, but instead, I found only Gary sitting there. He looked up when he noticed me and, without hesitation, informed me that Stephen and his companion had left for a trip. Hearing this news sent a mix of emotions rushing through me: surprise, relief, and a strange sense of freedom. With Stephen gone, I knew this was the perfect opportunity to put my plan into motion without any interference. I turned to Gary and shared my decision with him. I was going to divorce Stephen and move out for good. He didn't hesitate for a moment before offering his full support, assuring me he would help in any way he could. It was comforting to have someone in my corner, reinforcing that I was making the right choice. The next step was clearing out everything that no longer served me. When the junk removal team arrived, I instructed them to take away all the items from 3 specific rooms. I made sure to include everything, even the newer purchases, because I wanted a completely fresh start. However, I deliberately left the living room untouched. I knew that if I got rid of everything in there, Stephen would undoubtedly cause trouble later, and I wanted to avoid any unnecessary conflicts regarding assets. By the time evening arrived, Gary and I had completed the first major step of our escape. Our belongings were now in the hands of a moving company, stored safely until we could figure out our next destination. Since we hadn't yet found a new place to settle down, we checked into a nearby hotel, planning to stay there temporarily. Just as we were trying to enjoy a peaceful breakfast a few days later, my phone rang. It was Stephen. His voice carried disbelief as he asked about the missing furniture and appliances. His confusion and growing frustration were obvious. Without missing a beat, I shot back at him with a sharp response, implying that it had all been his idea to begin with. His reaction was exactly what I expected, stumbling over his words, struggling to piece together an argument. When he realized the extent of what had been discarded, his panic increased. Of all the things that had been removed, there was one item that seemed to matter to him most: a computer. I had anticipated this, so I played along, pretending to be unaware of its whereabouts. I reassured him that most of the household essentials were still intact, while letting him scramble to figure out where the missing computer had gone. This entire interaction was a clear indicator of how things had shifted between us. For the first time, I held the power in our dynamic. When Stephen found out that I had planned to get rid of a computer I had originally purchased for Gary, his desperation became even more evident. Sensing an opportunity, I made him an offer. If he wanted it back, he'd have to buy it from me. The sheer irony of him having to repurchase something that was originally a gift was not lost on me. When I named the outrageous price of $31,000, he was completely taken aback. He protested, but I held firm, refusing to back down. Eventually, after much resistance, he agreed to pay the price. It was an immensely satisfying moment, one that felt like the perfect form of payback. However, I wasn't done yet. After finalizing the deal, I told Stephen he'd have to wait for the computer because it was still with the movers. This small delay only added to his frustration, but he had no choice but to comply. Once I finally settled into a new home with Gary's help, Stephen followed through with the payment. Seeing this as the perfect chance to secure Gary's future, I encouraged him to use the money to gain independence. With it, he was able to move into his own apartment, conveniently close to his college. Yet, my plan didn't end there. Before sending the computer back to Stephen, I made a crucial move. I removed an external disk that had been attached to it. This was the key piece that would escalate my revenge to an entirely new level. Instead of keeping it for myself, I packaged the disk and mailed it directly to Stephen's boss at his company, along with a letter that was sure to capture his attention. Not long after, Stephen's boss, Mr. Dennis, reached out and invited me to his office. When I arrived at the company, I announced myself at the reception and waited with anticipation, knowing that this was the moment when everything would come to light. Soon, I was led to an office where I was greeted by Mr. Dennis. Sitting in the room was Stephen, his discomfort evident as he stood up in shock upon seeing me. I met his gaze with a calm smile before plainly stating that this was the revenge he deserved. Mr. Dennis wasted no time, setting the external disk on his desk and addressing the pressing issue, the stolen company data it contained. It was clear Stephen had illegally taken confidential client data from the company, something that was strictly forbidden. He fumbled through a series of excuses, but they only made his situation worse. Mr. Dennis's patience wore thin as he firmly stated the severity of Stephen's actions. He explained that this could be classified as corporate theft or a breach of competitive regulations. The mere mention of potential criminal charges made Stephen crumble. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by desperate pleas for mercy. As I watched, I recalled how I had initially discovered Stephen's secret. I had noticed him using Gary's computer suspiciously before our divorce, which was odd considering he had his own. Later, upon checking an external disk that had been left attached to the device, I found unfamiliar files that turned out to be stolen company data. That discovery had led me to this very moment, watching Stephen face the consequences of his unethical actions. Just when I thought things couldn't get any better, another unexpected development unfolded. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Susan. The moment she stepped in and saw me, her expression changed. She demanded to know why I was there. But before she could dismiss me, Mr. Dennis turned his focus to her. He brought up the recent investigation into a potential data leak and her plans to start a competing business. It didn't take long for everything to unravel. Susan and Stephen had been conspiring together, planning to use stolen client data to gain an advantage for Susan's new venture. At this point, my interest in their downfall had dwindled. Their greed and betrayal had caught up to them in the most fitting way possible. Mr. Dennis confirmed that their actions had not gone unnoticed and that legal action would follow. Both Stephen and Susan were now facing potential lawsuits, financial ruin, and criminal charges. For the final blow, I pulled out a photograph and placed it on the table, proof of Susan's infidelity with another man. The revelation hit Stephen like a slap to the face. His expression was a mix of disbelief and humiliation, while Susan scrambled to come up with excuses. Their argument quickly descended into a chaotic exchange of accusations. Watching them squabble, I couldn't help but remind Stephen of his past mocking words about age, now ironically used against him. Mr. Dennis, tired of their drama, refocused the conversation on their legal consequences. With the company moving forward with pressing charges, the weight of their actions was finally settling in. Their once cunning scheme had fallen apart, leaving them with nothing but regret. As I walked away from that office, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I had exposed the truth, ensured accountability, and most importantly, freed myself from a toxic past. Moving forward, I focused on my work and my personal happiness, finding peace in the life I was building. Gary's newfound independence, my career growth, and the stability I had long craved gave me the strength to leave the past behind. I had finally carved out a future that belonged solely to me, a future filled with hope, freedom, and the promise of a better tomorrow.